Data is the lifeblood of a modern organization. And while many businesses have the intention of using it in an ethical way, in reality, it can be tricky because sometimes it could be perceived as an advantage to use it in a less than ethical way in order to get ahead. But is it possible to actually be ethical with your data whilst also providing your customers with the best service possible, all while keeping your data and company as a whole secure? I'm Danny Palmer. This is DediNet Security Update, and with me to discuss this privacy paradox is Holly Armitage, Principal Strategist at BAE Systems Applied Intelligence. Thanks for joining me, Holly. So first of all, how does being ethical with data work in the modern age?
Hi, Danny. So thanks very much for having me. So for me, data ethics is more than just AI ethics. So when we look at data ethics, the first one often comes up is about algorithms and how organizations are using data. But for me, data ethics is about the whole data lifecycle, how organizations of all shapes and sizes and sectors are kind of making sense of all their customers and consumers and citizens' data they're using, and how to use that data in a way that aligns with their organizational values and that creates value for both themselves as an organization, but also their customers and consumers.
So for an organization looking to start out in this area or trying to get the optimum model of doing this, how do they do it and what are the pitfalls around it? Because as mentioned in the introduction, using data ethically sounds like a good idea for everyone in practice, but when it comes to using it in reality, it's quite easy to start finding pitfalls and falling into them at a rapid pace.
I mean, that's such a great question, Danny. So I think to start with, I suppose, what do we mean by data ethics? So actually, before we joined on this call, actually, did a quick Google search and I kind of whacked in, what do we mean by data ethics? I think that's kind of over like 400 million results. So you kind of look at those definitions, there's a real myriad. There's kind of from the slightly too simplistic right through to these phenomenal philosophical essays with frameworks and models and thought pieces, which, you sort of need a lot of time to sit through and read. I suppose for today, what I'm talking about is data ethics refers to the data itself, how that data is generated, how it's recorded, shared, and what we do with that data and how we leverage and explore it and interpret it. So the ethics part considers those moral principles, what's good for individuals and society, what are the rights and responsibilities for those who provide data, but also for the organization who's looking to leverage the value of that data. And I suppose thinking about them, what's that judgment? What's that criteria for what you should and what's right through data and what's wrong with data? And I suppose as we know from, everyday life, ethics doesn't always show us the right answer to moral problems. Morals as concepts, they get really under our skin because they relate to kind of our emotional issues. And for me, a really big thing is data ethics, for it to be actually useful and to add real value for organizations. It's got to be a way more than kind of a what you mustn't do list. It can't just be this, as you mentioned, compliance tick list and a checklist of what organizations shouldn't do. And I think when I'm thinking about data ethics and I'm working with organizations and, my past experience and working with data, I should expect data ethics to give us several answers, maybe several right answers, or maybe just some bad answers. Because the challenge is for us to kind of explore them and choose between them and think about, on balance, what is the right thing to do going forwards? So I think, we talked about pitfalls and challenges. And I suppose for me, two of the key challenges or areas to explore in data ethics spaces, what should those data ethics look like? And I sort of don't think you can kind of pop down to a shop and, buy a set of kind of vanilla data ethics and just plug and play into your organization. Nor do I think you can perhaps borrow ethics from other people. I think often if you kind of Google data ethics, you get some really great kind of vanilla statements coming back. But a bit like your personal ethics, you and me may have different views on our own personal ethics, and it's the same in data ethics. And I think, one of my key points, I'm really passionate about is for data ethics to actually support an organization and actually add real value. It needs to be an extension of what your organization's overall values and principles are, what the right thing means for you, company A, or you, company B.
So how can organizations go about to making it so it does add value? Because we've seen in plenty of times over the years how using data, or so you could say exploiting data in a less than ethical way has been used by businesses because they think they can get ahead in some way by doing it. In some cases, that has resulted in large fines or very negative media reports about how they've used this. So how do organizations not use data in a way that could be perceived as unethical like that? And how can they ensure that they are getting the best out of it? Because as mentioned, they want to use it in as in an efficient a way as possible, but while also still being ethical, which in some cases is creating this paradox.
So for me, I believe the very beginning of a data ethics discussion has to start with what your organizational core values are. So I'm not sure, but if you like, if you pop to your local branch, before lockdown, when you could walk into a bank, or when I'm going on and visiting organizations, you walk into their reception, their lobby, their atrium, and you may see a really glossy poster that kind of articulates their core values. If you look on some of the government websites, for example, HMRC have their taxpayer charter and stand, their core values, kind of what they're there to serve and do and how they treat each other. And I think too often organizations, write their core values and they kind of just leave them there. But as I said earlier, for me, if you want those values to kind of add value, think about what they mean for your ethics. So, if an organization's values, if they really reflect their organization's culture, they can be the most incredible, powerful starting block for data ethics conversations. So, as mentioned earlier, ethics can be very high level and it can be super abstract, which isn't always helpful. But I suppose the actions taken off the back of data have really real consequences. And I suppose for me, it's that having that clear, traceable link between organizations' values, what they say they do, how they say they act, the standards they hold themselves and their people to, and the data-driven action that brings ethics to life. So whenever I'm kind of thinking about data ethics, or I'm going into talks about data ethics, I start off perhaps looking at their internet page. What do they say they do? What do they mean? And how does that translate into data? So, organizations that talk about, about transparency, I would expect to see something around some really clear kind of cookie policy. So, sometimes you have to go really burying on organizations' websites to go and find kind of their privacy policies. But an organization that says they kind of act in a transparent and open way, I would sort of expect people to find those easily in really easy language as well. That's one of the first things I think organizations can start doing. But it's understanding what your values are and how they translate back. And when you look at that data action, when you look at it as a collective set, are you happy with that? And I think of my earlier point that how organizations use data is unique to what they're there to serve and do, and what's right for organization A, what's right for organization B. But I think by having those conversations and actually even looking at what you do with data and saying, are we happy with that? Are the actions we're taking, both very openly or behind the scenes in-house, do they align with who we say we are? We had, if the press got hold of this or the media, there was a story in this, would we be happy? Are we happy with what these saying about us?
That's the thing. It's very tricky to, if it's tricky for you to project these values of your supposedly ethical ways of doing this, and you can't do it. It's difficult. This must be difficult to start with. If you can't say, oh, look, here's how we're doing this, how are you supposed to even do it? That's got to be a challenge in of itself.
Exactly. But I think it doesn't have to be. I think sometimes we get very caught up. I know sometimes when I'm practicing data, all the data ethics, it's such a big word, data ethics, it has lots of connotations, the philosophy behind data. It's very easy to get caught up in your head in this subject. So, I would, as an organization, if you take what are those handful of things that you are here to do, what are those standards that you expect your colleagues to kind of hold themselves to and you to work to as well, and literally translate them into data. What does that mean for your data action? I think that's, for me, my first big thing. You kind of need to embrace that complexity and be really honest. It can be hard, but I think it's starting somewhere and kind of keeping that really open mindset to keep thinking and learning, really similar to your personal ethics. So how you as an individual, make your decisions, the ethics you hold yourself and your friends and family to. It's applying almost that similar thinking to your organization. And I think it's about recognizing that data ethics, in my opinion, is there to facilitate the conversation. It's to make sure the issues are being make sure they are being discussed and understood, and really importantly, understand the trade-offs. It's not always about having these are ethics, so the answer therefore must be A, not B. It's having that conversation of why is it A, not B? Should it be A and B, or is it not A or B? I think it's about those conversations. So yeah, my first thing would be just start talking about ethics.
Is there a way that an approach like this, making sure you're ethical with data, can help improve the organization as a whole? I mean, we see lots of examples of how organizations have suffered data breaches because they've not really been certain as to how data is being used or stored. Well, if you are examining your data use and you know that this data is being used in this way and it's being stored in this way, can that help, ultimately improve cybersecurity posture in that way?
Oh my gosh, of course. Yes, definitely. So I think because it has the conversation, I think often as data practitioners, we can get so involved in our work. We talk in this really obscure data cyber language that sometimes doesn't make sense to anyone. A real challenge of working at home has been people overhearing your conversation saying, what actually do? You're talking jargon all day long. And I think sometimes we forget that actually we're there to help solve the business problems. And there's a real responsibility for us to make sure that what we're doing in data, what we're doing in security and cyber and technology actually translates into business speak. And as I said, I think data ethics and being really talking about those opportunities and the challenges that we are exploring in our data world, we're talking about them in really plain English. We can only bring people with us, the rest of the organization with us. And again, having those conversations about the choices we're making and exploring. And again, just making sure that's really clear across the organization and people understand those trade-offs. People can make those informed choices. So for me, data ethics is all around facilitating conversations, facilitating choices, and really kind of almost complete transparency around those trade-offs.
So when it comes to a sort of data officer or a sort of compliance officer wanting to tell their senior members of their organization that this is how you should be doing things, how can they try and make sure that they can do that? Because imagine for some companies and some boards, they're going to be thinking about other things maybe rather than sort of how data is ethically used. They might be wanting to look at how can we use this data for profit, for example, for as much as possible. So how can officers or the people responsible for making decisions around this tell those above that, look, this is how you should be doing this and this is how it will bring benefits?
So a really great question. And I think, for me, data ethics is really similar to organizational values. It's about the whole organization. It's not just about the data teams. But the first thing is getting people bought from the beginning. It's not about the data function saying, we're going to define and develop the data ethics. And there you go. Here they are. Go and do it. It's about getting everyone in a group together and discussing as a community what those ethics are. And you're always focusing around the business language. And there's a real role here for your chief data officer, your data teams, your tech teams, to really start kind of talking about some of the myths in data. So data ethics conversations provide an opportunity to talk about those technology myths. So for example, AI is not going to solve all your problems, not always, and I think there's a real chance there to kind of use the data ethics conversations to start unpacking some of those myths and misconceptions, but also get buy-in and realistic buy-in about what you can and can't do. So sometimes, I'm in meetings and I hear things like, oh, the data is never going to solve that problem for you. And it's not going to do these for these legal reasons, these ethical reasons. But again, having that conversation, and because ethics is about conversations and it's about kind of getting organizations on the same page, about acting in a really consistent way, it's a great chance to have those opportunities and conversations.
So to sum up, I suppose, how can organizations get around this privacy paradox we've been discussing? Because as as stated, it does definitely have benefits, but yeah, as just touched upon as well, it can be tricky to project this. So yeah, what is the how is the balance found here in terms of setting this out across the organization?
So I suppose for me, there are kind of four things. I'm going to say four things I would kind of advocate people try exploring now. So first of all, avoid boilerplate ethics. You know, as I said, what's right for one organization might not be right for your organization. So by all means, have a look at how others are doing it. There's some great examples and templates out there, but don't just kind of adopt other people's ethics and put them as your own, because they're not actually going to help your business go. Secondly, start with your organizational values. Start with what your organization says they're there to do and how they act, and just translate them into data speak. So the same way, you know, you translate from English to French or French into German, do the same with data. Bring people in a team and say, these are organizational values. This is what we tell the world we're here to do. Let's translate them into data. What do they look like when they're translated? My third point would be, you know, as you said to Danny earlier, this is more than a checklist. You know, we know from our everyday lives, ethical problems aren't simple. They are multifaceted, and frequently there's no single right answer. And I think for ethics to be taken seriously, it has to be so much more than a checklist of what you mustn't do. It's about having that clarity about what your organizational culture is and how it relates to the things you do with data. And then lastly, you know, about kind of balancing pragmatism. You know, it is a complex area, and it's about being really honest with yourselves and your teams. You won't always get it right. You need to keep thinking and keep learning. But I think as long as you're having those conversations, you're thinking pragmatically, and you're starting the conversation, you're in a whole much healthier place than you were yesterday.
That's some useful advice, Holly. Thanks for joining me on ZDNet Security Update. And for more information on cybersecurity and data compliance, be sure to keep watching ZDNet YouTube channel, like and subscribe to ZDNet YouTube channel. And of course, there's plenty of news, articles, and features on zdnet.com. Thanks for watching.